Hi, I'm Scott Beaulier, Director of the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University and host of EconVersations. On tonight's show, we have a colleague of mine in the center, Dr. Dan Sutter, who's the Charles Koch Professor of Economics and a leading researcher in the field of natural disaster economics. He's committed a significant amount of time and research energy to investigating the effects tornadoes have on individual behavior, what can be done to reduce the inefficiencies that result from these natural disasters, and how people cope with significant tornadoes like those that broke out in 2011 and those that have broken out in many years in the past. Dan, great to have you on the show again. Welcome back.
Thanks.
Yeah, let's get into this, because I think one of the things that a lot of people watching our show tonight and a lot of people who talk to you wonder is, like, where did you get interested in tornadoes? You're an economist. Where's the overlap there, and what sparked this interest in tornado research?
Well, it was just it started off with just a personal interest. I'd always been, since I was young, very afraid of tornadoes. Growing up in southern Michigan, where they actually have more tornadoes than you think, and so I'd always been afraid of tornadoes. And then about 10 years ago, I was teaching at the University of Oklahoma, which is in the center of Tornado Alley, which of course it led to a lot of insecurity or frightened. I was very frightened to be moving to Oklahoma, the center of Tornado Alley, where the Wizard of Oz and everything. And there was a very significant outbreak of tornadoes in 1999, and it was about the time where I first purchased a house, and I knew that there were these things, tornado safe rooms and shelters that you could buy, but none of the homes that were available for sale there in Oklahoma had basements, and so I was concerned, if there was a tornado, where would I go? And so I was interested in tornado shelters, and then it occurred to me as an economist, like, well, I have the research tools to be able to quantify something like that, and to calculate something like what we call in the risk analysis literature a cost per life saved, and maybe that could help me make a better decision, and maybe by learning more about tornadoes, I could address some of my own personal fears or insecurities, and that got me started. It's at the University of Oklahoma, where they have the National Severe Storms Laboratory, the Storm Prediction Center that puts out tornado watches for the entire country, and a lot of the leading tornado researchers in the world. And so once I started working on this and started talking to them, one thing led to another, and now a decade later I've written 2 books on the topic.
Mm-hmm. And we have the books up here just in the background for our viewers. The Economic and Societal Impact of Tornadoes, which was a 2011 publication put out by the American Meteorological Society?
Yes.
Okay. And then a follow-up book called Deadly Season, which looks strictly at the Joplin and Tuscaloosa tornadoes, or I guess that whole pattern of tornadoes, which was a very active 2011 season.
Right, you're right, the deadly 2011 season. And we sort of came up with that idea for the follow-up book because we had just published in March of last year the first book on the economic and societal impacts of tornadoes. Oh, I should mention that both of these are co-authored with Kevin Simmons, my colleague. He's at Austin College now in Texas. He was working in Oklahoma at the time when we started collaborating on this research about a decade ago. Okay. We put out the first book looking at what had happened to reduce tornado casualties in the U.S. up through like 2007, and so that book comes out, and then starting the next month we had all these terribly deadly tornadoes, and so that made us think that we should revisit this topic and see if any of our conclusions needed to be adjusted. So.
Did any of your conclusions need to be adjusted, or was 2011 just a particularly fluky year? Well,
for our challenge in the Deadly Season book is we wanted to basically ask the question, given what had happened in the recent past with tornadoes, could the death tolls in 2011 have been predicted? Mm-hmm. There were 550 deaths nationwide, which was the highest death total since the 1930s. Mm-hmm. So the deadliest tornado year in like more than 60 years in the nation. And so it seemed like, for comparison purposes, that over the last 10 years or so, we've been averaging about 50 or 60 deaths nationally. So 10 times more than the recent average. It's a complete outlier or year. So then the question then becomes why. And so was it extreme weather? It would basically come down to the question of, is it extreme weather or some type of extreme vulnerability or heretofore unrecognized vulnerability that, that we hadn't picked up on in our previous book. And so we wanted to address that question. We do it with a variety of different techniques, but basically we show that you can come pretty close to predicting the fatality totals in 2011 using a number of different metrics that we could have, a number of different patterns of tornado fatalities in recent years. And what that means is that essentially it was the number of strong and particularly violent tornadoes, the tornadoes that are rated EF4, EF5 on this on the enhanced Fujita scale. The Tuscaloosa tornado was an EF4 tornado. The Joplin tornado was an EF5 tornado. The number of these very strong and particularly long-tracked tornadoes that happened to hit very populated areas explains basically the death toll in 2011. Now, that's sort of nice going forward because it shows that there wasn't, like, say, a breakdown of the National Weather Service or a breakdown of the warning process last year. It was just really bad weather that led to most of the death total last year.
Let's backtrack a little bit and just talk about your interest and the contribution an economist can make to this field. Yeah, I'm assuming there are a lot of experts at conferences that you go to in the field of tornado research who can tell you about what it takes high in the atmosphere to produce a tornado, and they can show you really neat models of how these things can blow up. And you're bringing to the conversation ideas about probability and cost and this notion of a cost per human life. How are your contributions kind of viewed and received, and is there a lot of value being added by having an economist at the table?
I think it certainly adds a lot of value because I know the meteorologists who study tornadoes for a living, most of them are really motivated by a desire to reduce the impact of these tornadoes, to try to do things that can, whether it be tornado warnings or tornado watches or other studying under why tornadoes develop that can help save lives. And so ultimately they're very interested in trying to save lives, and the National Weather Service has that as their mission. Their formal mission is to protect lives and property. And to be able to answer those questions, you need to be able to study systematically what works and what doesn't work. And that's, I think, as an economist, where we can come in and provide assistance. We have both theoretical and statistical tools that allow us to evaluate the effect of, say, tornado warnings on tornado casualties, or false alarms from the warnings on tornado casualties. We can investigate things like just how many lives might we expect to save with tornado safe rooms or shelters. And give specific hard number answers that can really help inform the decision. Just as one indication of this, research that we've done indicated that one of the that up until a few years ago, the largest component of the impact of tornadoes on the U.S. was actually the time spent under tornado warnings. We're spending on average in the nation about 240 million person hours under time spent under warnings. And granted, not everybody's going to respond to the warnings, but many businesses have to shut down. Universities have policies in place to suspend classes while they're under a tornado warning. And so that was actually the largest component. It swamped like the amount of the property damage. It was greater than the dollar value of the lives that would be lost. When we had about 55 or 60 deaths per year. The Weather Service in 2011 introduced what are known as storm-based warnings that they were attempting to refine the area that was being warned before tornadoes were being warned for by the county that they were threatening to strike. And so storm-based warnings reduce the area under a tornado warning typically by about 70 or 75%. That meant that we were saving about 75% of the time that was being spent under warning. Hundreds of millions of person hours worth, billions of dollars a year without compromising safety. And so, I don't think anybody even myself, before we started to do these calculations, had any idea that that was such a huge cost, a huge component of the cost of tornadoes. And it's something you just don't get at without some systematic, formalized analysis of some numbers.
I'm assuming there was some pushback on this, though, that people said, oh, this storm-based warning model is going to leave out a few people on the edges or something, and you're using money and dollars to drive decisions as opposed to just, you know, a broad brush that's going to protect and keep everyone safe. And your whole point, I think, is it's safety at what cost, right?
Right, it's a part of it, and I think, again, that's an important perspective economists can bring to this, that safety, that, well, in economics and risk analysis, we come up with, you know, what's known as like an optimal level of safety or an optimal number of deaths, which strike people as perhaps repulsive or you know, odd at the very least. But what you're trying to do is, what you really want to try to do is minimize the impact of something like tornadoes on society, and also you have to factor in there what's the value or what's the amount of the cost that you're incurring to try to reduce those impacts. And what you really want to try to do is reduce the sum of these two, both the cost of tornadoes themselves plus the cost of everything that you're doing to try to reduce tornado impacts. And if, you know, in the limiting case, the example I always like to use to illustrate this idea is, I mean, suppose you could spend all of our GDP to save a life. You know, oftentimes you hear people make the statement like, oh, but if this policy saves even one life, it's worth it. Well, let's ask the question, is it really worth it? If you could spend all of our nation's GDP to save a life in a year, well, the people would have no, you know, we would have no resources left over to eat, or, you know, for medicine or for any of the other things in life that we need to sustain ourselves. If you push that out to the limit, I mean, people would be starving to death. They wouldn't have any medicine to take, so people would be dying of common ailments that we have antibiotics for. And so clearly, when you take it, you look at it that way, you can get across this point that we have to consider how much we're spending to save lives versus the number of lives that we're trying to save. And then there's always the idea that if you want to try to reduce a life, you want to do it at the lowest cost way that you can. And so economics can bring on a powerful tool in just in terms of cost effectiveness analysis to say, if we have different ways to try to improve safety, what's the least costly way?
Mm-hmm. Let's stick on this warning system topic for a little bit longer, and something that seems like it must also be a cost of warnings is the false warnings. You know, the ones where you don't actually have a tornado, but it causes people to adjust their behavior. And if you have enough warnings without an actual positive, a tornado, you become fatigued and just say, well, this is just, you know, another warning that's going off that I don't need to pay attention to. And to what extent is that, you know, driving, you know, some of these crazy outcomes that we're seeing in terms of number of deaths, and people just saying, well, they're warning all the time, right. And it's probably for miles away from here as opposed to actually looking at their weather reports and getting into their safe areas.
Exactly. The National Weather Service did a service assessment after the Joplin tornado, and so they conducted some interviews with Joplin residents, and that was one refrain that came up in most of these interviews. They made the statement like, well, they're always turning on the sirens, and you know, there's never a tornado, and so they were sort of dismissing the tornado sirens when they went off as not necessarily indicating a danger. And in our research, Kevin Simmons and I have been able to document that there is a false alarm effect, and that's actually perhaps one of the most important, from just a scholarly research perspective, contributions of our research, because in research on hazards warnings, nobody had been able to document a false alarm effect in the field. It's shown up in experiments. It's certainly plausible that there should be a cry wolf effect, right. But nobody had been able to find this, primarily looking at hurricane warning and hurricane evacuation. But we were able to find that, yes, if you have a higher false alarm rate, it does lead to more deaths. Now, you know, from the Weather Service's standpoint, if you're a Weather Service forecaster, there is a trade-off between the probability of detection, in other words, whether you're going to issue a warning for a tornado, and then also issuing a bunch of false alarms. You could have a warning issued for every tornado that could possibly form by just simply issuing a tornado warning for any random thunderstorm. Tornadoes are going to come out of the thunderstorm, so if you warn for everything, you will have that probability of detection moved up to 1. But the problem is you'll be having so many false alarms that would it be worth it? Well, if you couldn't show that there was a false alarm effect on casualties, then pushing that probability of detection up to 1, adjusting that trade-off in such a way to try to warn for everything, would seemingly be the route to go. Now, the Weather Service had never done that because they sort of just intuitively thought that there would be a false alarm effect. And our research actually showed that they were making that trade-off, because in economics we're all about trade-offs. And so when we start as economists looking at this, like, yes, this is a trade-off, and so now you have to value the effect of warnings versus false alarms on deaths. And it turned out that the Weather Service had been all along doing this, been making this trade-off pretty close to optimally, at least based on our research and the limits of our statistical analysis. So there's a case where the Weather Service seemingly was getting it right without the numbers, but it's always good to have the numbers and to make sure that you were doing that, making a decision like that properly.
Another thing related to these warnings that they release that comes out of your research is the idea that they not only should be localized and try to stick as close to the storm area as possible, but the length of them. You want to have it. You want to give people advanced warning, but you don't want it 45 minutes ahead of time or an hour ahead of time, right? It's get that warning on. What is your recommendation, like 15 or 20 minutes, or?
Our research shows that there doesn't appear to be any benefits in terms of a reduction in fatalities or injuries if you have a lead time beyond 15 minutes. Okay. So there's no, what we like to refer to as marginal value. There doesn't appear to be a marginal value of extending lead times out beyond 15 minutes, at least based on what people have done in the past. Now that's of significance because the technology is beginning to develop that might allow the Weather Service within the next decade to perhaps push the lead times out to an hour or two. So it looks like technologically that's going to be possible. I think one of the major things they'd have to be careful about this is that it goes back to what we showed with the time spent under warnings. If you're going to put out a warning with a 2-hour advance notice, then you're just extending that time that it's spent under warnings, and sort of unnecessarily. So I mean, what's going to be necessary is that if you're going to give a warning, say an hour in advance, you really have to emphasize what's the start time of the threat. So when do people have to shut things down? When do they have to go to a safe place? Because it's not going to be immediately. And if people are interpreting this as like, well, you have to go to a safe place immediately, and after an hour, they're probably going to wonder like what's going on and conclude that the warning is a false alarm, when really the threat hasn't begun yet. Right. So they're going to have to be very careful to make sure that they emphasize what's the start time for a threat and not just issue a warning 2 hours in advance.
It seems like the ability to predict these major storm days has improved significantly. Like there were days that classes were canceled, or schools, mainly at the K through 12 level, schools were let out early because it was going to be a really spooky day storm-wise. To what extent are these broad declarations that it's going to be a major day helping save lives and helping people adjust to the tornadoes?
Well, people what they're doing is the Storm Prediction Center is now releasing publicly these what are called convective outlooks, where they rate it as to whether it might be a low risk or high risk of severe weather, and particularly long-track dangerous tornadoes. And people are reacting to this. As you mentioned, schools seem to be one user of this to cancel or let classes out early. But they're not the only one. We know that NASCAR has postponed racing on a couple of days in which there's perceived to be a high risk of tornadoes. Now, we haven't been able to do any research, and this is one component of the warning system that's not been researched at all. We really don't even know who all is using these convective outlooks to adjust behavior, how they're adjusting their behavior. and whether they're actually producing any value or not. Because if you don't know exactly what the trade-off is, you're sort of guessing. You might think that this is a new product, and so you might be using something even though if you really could look at the numbers, maybe you wouldn't want to, or maybe eventually people would stop using it. So we do know that people are using these outlooks. We just don't know how they might be translating into any kind of benefits to society. We presume there should be some, but a lot of these are somewhat tricky because a number of school districts have installed safe rooms in their schools, and even if they don't have a safe room in their school, if you're canceling classes and sending students home, many of those students might live in mobile homes, and mobile homes are really vulnerable to tornadoes. And so canceling classes and sending students home may be actually leading to more deaths than fewer deaths if schools are a relatively safe location. And particularly if your school has invested several $1 million to build large safe rooms that can shelter all the students with close to absolute safety in one of these modern safe rooms, then clearly canceling classes isn't going to be something you're going to want to do.
Yeah, you bring to mind some of our conversations that we've had during active storm days here, where you point out that some of the buildings on the Troy campus are probably the safest buildings to be in, as opposed to going home and being in a home that probably leaves you a little bit more susceptible.
Certainly, and there are things that you can do. It's always hard as just a layperson looking at a building to know where the safest area would be. But there are the engineers that, for instance, school districts can bring in. That if a school district didn't want to install a safe room, what they should definitely do is make sure they bring in an engineer to examine a school and make sure that you're actually sheltering students in the safest area of the school, because sometimes an engineer can tell you that that's not actually the safest place to be. And so existing schools and well-built engineered buildings usually provide a pretty good amount, not perfect protection, but pretty good amount of protection. There are a lot of anecdotes of restaurants where their employees have taken customers into like the freezer during a tornado, and the restaurant gets destroyed, but they manage to survive in the freezer because it's a pretty well-built shelter. And so there are a lot of sheltering options available, and well-built schools and buildings like we have here on the Troy campus offer quite a bit of protection.
The fact that shelters often provide protection often leads policymakers to say that we should be building safe houses for people. We should be subsidizing the building of safe houses. Here in Alabama, almost no one has basements. We need something to protect people in the event of an outbreak. And you've looked at this from just a very careful calculation of benefits relative to life saved and the costs that are involved in it as well. What does your analysis tell us about how policy should be directed at these things?
When you do the numbers, when you calculate this cost per life saved, you see is that for people who live in single-family homes, permanent homes, what the Weather Service calls permanent homes, the cost per life saved for shelters is pretty high. It's around $40 million per life saved, even in a state like Alabama, where we have the highest number of tornado fatalities since 1950. The reason for this is that homes provide a pretty reasonable amount of protection, especially against all except the most powerful tornadoes. And even against the most powerful tornadoes, approximately, perhaps about 1% of the people who were in the path of the tornado in Joplin perished last year. And now that's a high number, but that was an extremely powerful tornado as well. And so even in those cases, many people, by going to shelter inside their homes, were able to protect themselves. Now, that's of relevance when it comes to the policy question of whether tornado shelters should be subsidized. Because there's two parts to the tornado shelter question. First off, whether a family should invest in protecting themselves. And as an economist, I'm extremely I don't try to prescribe those decisions for others. It's up to each family here in Alabama to make a decision about whether they think a shelter is a wise investment. Because ultimately, you're the ones who are you're protecting yourselves. That's a very personal value, and I can't tell you how much you should value that. Now, the cost per life saved is relevant when we come to policy discussions, because from a government standpoint, the government resources are scarce for government, and so if you're going to offer subsidies or tax credits to try to encourage the building of shelters, it's important to keep in mind that you're using tax dollars for that, and you can ask a question of whether you're actually saving lives by doing that, because when you take dollars out of individuals' hands, then they have less money to spend, and that means less money to spend on things, including things like that can improve their own safety. Mm-hmm. So if people are poor, economists can show that that they're less likely to, say, repair their cars or go to the doctor and do a lot of other things that could save lives. And so if you're investing money on from a policy standpoint on things that aren't cost effective enough, you could actually end up leading to more deaths by making people poorer and not allowing them to do the things that can protect themselves in their own daily lives. And so it becomes very important for tornado shelters, as deadly as frightening and scary as tornadoes are, and especially after a year like 2011 in Alabama where there were so many deaths, it's important to keep in mind that overall the shelters don't offer a lot of value relative in permanent homes, don't offer a lot of value, and that the number is up at a level where the state might actually be leading to more deaths if they try to subsidize tornado shelters than otherwise.
I suspect that policymakers don't exactly get that message, though, necessarily, when you say, look, the payoff on this isn't great, and you may actually be putting us at risk. We'd be better if you just took that money and didn't do anything with it, or bought people weather radios or something instead. I'm assuming it's a message they don't really want to hear, and they're not real responsive to it, because a tornado shelter is real visible and it shows that you're getting people ready for the future. Is that often how it plays out politically?
And certainly, when there is a tornado and people do shelter inside of a safe room, and then they come out afterwards, it's a very tangible and visible benefit. It's like you come out and you see your home blown away, and you really get the sense of the benefit from that. I mean, I think a lot of politicians and people do sort of intuitively get the point that this isn't worth investing in. They might frame it a little differently in terms of that they might consider that it's just bad luck or it's fate. If you end up being right in the middle of the path of a very powerful tornado, that your number was up, that it is God's will, whatever way you want to think about that, and that might be a very effective coping mechanism to deal with these low probability risks in life when you're going to make at some level, a rational decision not to deal with those. So then how do we as individuals live with our choices that we make? And so I think a lot more people get that message than you might think. Certainly there are some politicians who want to I think, try to get some benefits, political benefits, from being able to say, see, we brought all these safe rooms, we're providing protection. And then it's just so hard to identify the cost of what's not being spent, what people aren't spending money on when you subsidize safe rooms. Yeah.
Talking tornadoes has gone way too fast. We're just about out of time here, and we're going to have you back, because I want to ask you about the stories that we're hearing about how global warming is fueling a lot of tornado outbreaks, and why the number of tornado warnings seems to be climbing over time. So we need to get you back on here, but that's all the time we have tonight, and I really thank you for joining us again on the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Sure. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. Good night.